Good evening, everybody. My name is Mike Denham, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you to our January edition of the Florida Lecture Series produced by the Lawton Chiles Center for Florida History. And I want to thank all of you who were with us last semester and supported us this year with your attendance and financial support. This, of course, is our first program of the new year, and we're looking forward to the second half of our series, which begins tonight. Before I introduce tonight's special guests, I'd like to tell you about a couple of things that are in store on the horizon. Next month, we'll welcome one of America's leading historians on February 19th, Vernon Burton from Clemson University, who is the author of Justice Deferred, Race in the United States Supreme Court. He will put the spotlight on Florida cases before America's highest tribunal. Then on March 12th, we have a special event, unscheduled event, which I want to tell you about. We're going to screen a film. We're going to screen a film across the Honeyman Pavilion over in Branscombe 202 in a smaller room. And it's going to be a film on Florida's Chitlin Circuit. Does anybody know that term? That was, of course, an African-American rhythm and blues circuit that was very popular in the 1930s and 40s and 50s and 60s during the time of segregation. They went all over the United States, all over the South. And this film, which was produced by Bob Keeling, many of you remember he was our October speaker. This film was produced with Bob Keeling in support of from the Florida Humanities Council. So we'll be sending out more information on that event, so watch for it. And again, Florida's Chitlin Circuit. It's a terrific film, and I'm sure that you'll enjoy it. Now I'm delighted to introduce you to our special guest tonight. Many of you will remember Jason Vuic's terrific presentation on Swamp Peddlers, which is still very much resonating. He's been doing talks all over the state, as well as for his new book, while he's here in Florida with us. Among groups is the Florida Bar and the University of Florida groups as well. Then his next project was of course, which is the subject for tonight. In the 1980s, the tiny town of Arcadia, Florida, with its cowboy roots, low-wage agricultural industries, and violent frontier history, was a curious mix of the desolate ranchlands of West Texas and the stately homes and bitter race relations of the South. In this book, Mr. Vuic explores a town without pity, in which he recounts two heartbreaking stories from Arcadia that occurred in the 1980s that rose to national prominence in the end of the Reagan era and forced the town to reckon with not only AIDS hysteria, but the legacies of the racist past. Many of you will remember the late Judge Clifton Kelly, circuit judge, who was involved in one of these cases as a person who essentially went down later to try to sort out and get to the truth. Anyway, Jason is a native of Florida. He was raised in Punta Gorda, and while he lives in Fort Worth, Texas, we're fortunate that many of his book projects focus on Florida topics. He brings to this project a distinguished record as a writer of many excellent books, several of which are available tonight: Swamp Peddlers, The Yucks, 2 years in Tampa with the losingest team in the NFL. That's right, the 2 years of the Tampa Bay Bucks' first 2 seasons. The Yugo is another one of his books, The Rise and Fall of the Worst Car in History. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jason Vuic to our stage.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank Florida Southern. I wish to thank everyone for bringing me here, the Lawton Chiles Center, and to Mike in particular. It's amazing. This is almost 30 years of this series. And I asked him who he has brought in the past, and it's Janet Reno and Ruben Askew and Claude Kirk. I wonder if Pope John Paul had spoken about Florida here. He probably would have been in this series. So when you think about the New York Yankees, and they have like 7 all-stars in their lineup, and the last 2 guys, I'm like the 8th batter, right? I'm not the pitcher, because that'd be the designated hitter. That guy would be good too. Well, before I start, I live in Fort Worth, Texas today. I'm a stay-at-home dad. I have a special needs son, and my wife is the big historian. She's an endowed chair in military history, women in the military at Texas Christian. So I'm the second most famous historian in my house, which is definitely the truth. But I grew up in Punta Gorda. I'm a Floridian, and though I've lived all over after graduation from high school in 1990, I've never left mentally. This is my Bollywood. I love Florida. I love Florida and its messes. I love its history. But I love modern Florida specifically. I never studied it in college. I'm a professor at one time of East European history. That's my PhD. And my first books were on something completely different. But I've come back to Florida, and I think I'm here to stay in terms of writing. Now, I usually write happy books or silly books or snarky books. I'm Gen X. I wrote my first book on the Yugo car, the worst car ever. Then I wrote on the Bucks, the Yucks, the first 2 years in Tampa when they lost 26 games in a row. And somehow in the 70s helped define Tampa Bay as a region. Before the Bucks, no one ever said, I'm from Tampa Bay. If you had told a Cuban gentleman in South Tampa, are you from Tampa Bay? They'd say, what? I'm not a fish, man. I mean, what? I'm from Tampa, and I don't know anything about those waspy people over in St. Petersburg, right? And so I got into Tampa history, and I got into Florida history, and I wrote this book, The Swamp Peddlers, on land sales in the 50s and 60s. And I wanted to write a book about kind of Northerners being ripped off, like a Carl Hyacin true life story. How we're going to see these beautiful palm trees in Florida and Fort Myers, and we go to Lehigh Acres, and there's a wild hog and a cow in your yard, and it's scrub brush, and it's pine trees, right? That's what I wanted to write about, because that was my Florida. My Florida's not the beach, right? Punta Gorda was part of the world that Lakeland was in the 1800s, right? So this is a similar town to where I grew up. And next door to Punta Gorda, though, was a southern town, Arcadia, that when I visited as a kid in the 70s and as a high school athlete in the 80s, or I went to the rodeo or the farmer's market, it was 25 miles away. And though my town was sleepy and old with an old demographic, our world was on I-75. Our world was the Sun Belt. Our world depended on housing starts, not agriculture. Cows didn't matter anymore in Charlotte County when I was growing up. Oranges didn't matter anymore. It was who was building what, right? What communities were coming in. But 25 miles up the river, up the Peace River, up US 17, which I believe goes through here, right? 17, was a town that was from another age, was a town that even locals would say we're 50 miles and 50 years from Sarasota. That was a saying in Arcadia. I didn't come up with that. And I was eager, as I started to think about projects for Florida. I'm always looking for ideas and stories that I can use kind of as a prism to teach about Florida, to learn about Florida. And Arcadia was always a rugged, tough, working class agricultural Florida town, but it was the most representative small town to me. Everyone has that favorite small town in Florida, the Bartow or the Palatka or the Live Oak, or my grandparents were from Inverness. But Arcadia was different to me. And 2 things happened when I was in high school. I'm 53, so this is late 80s, 1987. I was maybe a freshman or a sophomore. And 2 events made national news. But they didn't just enter the national news. They caused a firestorm of publicity that sent tiny Arcadia kicking and screaming into the national spotlight. Is anyone familiar with the John Grisham book or the McConaughey film Time to Kill, where the town loses its mind? It was like that, where the media went nuts, the locals went nuts, everyone involved went nuts, right? And the national news trucks were outside the door, taking this little town, smaller than Bartow, but a Bartow-like town, just threw it into the national spotlight, and it wowed all of us. And it appalled a lot of America for what happened there. When Arcadia became, and this is no joke, the most detested, the most hated municipality in the United States for about a year. Everyone in America knew about Arcadia. They talked about Arcadia. It led the national news. And I'll never forget this. And so when I wanted to write about this small town, I knew right away there are two things that happened there that I couldn't do one without the other, though they weren't really related. And what drew them together was the town, okay? The first was the arrest and conviction in 1967 and exoneration in the 80s of a man named James Richardson. He was an illiterate black migrant worker, a fruit picker, who lived in the segregated section of Arcadia, which was called the Quarters. It's still called the Quarters today. That's a reference to workers' quarters. I learned that because in Immokalee, they have a quarters section. These places with a lot of migrant workers that have to live somewhere. And in 1967, most of the fruit pickers were black migrant workers. Now they're mostly Hispanic immigrants. Well, James Richardson was accused, and someone put parathion into the food of his children. Parathion is an orange grove insecticide that's banned. It's no longer used. Incredibly dangerous. Incredibly dangerous. I'm positive that people in Polk County have died of this in the 50s and 60s. Someone put it in the children's food. They were out in the fields. The kids were at home. There were 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds. And the older kids came home from the segregated elementary school, Smith Brown School. They consumed lunch with their family, with the other kids. It was rice and beans that the parents had made the night before. The parents were in the fields, and then the kids began to die. Horrible deaths, including 2 or 3 kids in elementary school. I interviewed their classmates. I interviewed someone who sat next to a girl who held her desk shaking, this is graphic, and died in front of her classmates, an 8-year-old. They were rushed to the hospital. James Richardson comes in from the fields, and he is asked by the hospital, do you have insurance, meaning to pay for these hours of work we've been doing? And he says, no, I tried to buy some from a traveling salesman last night of insurance, life insurance, and right away the sheriff looked at him, and that became the motive for the murder, regardless of the lack of a policy and the lack of any evidence whatsoever that he had done it. That became the motive. And Richardson eventually will go to prison for 20 years until a very dramatic exoneration, a movie-worthy exoneration in the late 1980s. Now, that was the first event, so keep Richardson in mind. The second made Arcadia even more famous, even more infamous. Richardson was famous. Richardson had a book written about him. Arcadia was pilloried in the press for racism, for a trial that didn't make sense, but it went away. 1968, he goes to prison, and it's forgotten. Then, 1986, 3 white boys, they suffered from hemophilia. Father was a prison guard. Mother was a part-time practical nurse, mostly stay-at-home mother. One of the brothers went to St. Pete for a surgery, and they gave him various blood tests just to see what was going on with this child, and he had HIV. They tested the family. The other 2 brothers had HIV, but not the sister and not the parents. It was because they had hemophilia. And in those days, people with hemophilia took a medicine to help their blood clot. It was a protein called factor VIII. You would inject yourself. Well, that protein came from pooled blood. Well, where did pharmaceutical companies get the pooled blood? Haiti, Lesotho, Skid Row, prisons all over the state, including prisons, Angola, right? So it had incredible amounts of hepatitis, but then because it was not tested by the federal government, there were no tests or kind of pasteurization process for blood to kill viruses. Many people who had blood transfusions got hepatitis, and then in the 1980s, they began to get AIDS before there was a test. And hemophiliacs, people with hemophilia, died by the thousands. That's one of the forgotten kind of holocausts in American medical history. We don't even know how many, but we believe 4,000 people died. If you had hemophilia in the 1980s, you definitely got hepatitis, and there was a good chance you ended up with AIDS when there was no cure. So this happened to these boys. They were told by their doctor, when you come back, tell your principal, tell your superintendent, they'll make accommodations. He had no idea what he was talking about. They told their principal, they were immediately kicked out of school, and the news spread like wildfire. Nobody would touch them, come near them, let their kids play with them. When they would eat at restaurants in town, people would throw away their plates and their silverware. Right? This was the era of afraids, they called it. When I remember this too. Does anybody know where Belglade is, the sugar town of Belglade? When AIDS first started, there was no cure, and it was called the 4-H disease. In the beginning, 4 homosexual men had it. The CDC reported. That was the first report, 1981. But heroin users, needle users, people from Haiti, and I'll explain that in a second, and people with hemophilia, because it's blood-borne. And we know for a fact Haiti came out of the Congo, and the UN was in the Congo, and who could speak French and was African-American or African-Caribbean, but Haitians. So in the 60s, Haitians, soldiers, went over there, had sex with prostitutes or had transfusions or whatever, came back to Haiti, and so the Haitians had a very big population of HIV. They weren't inherently more able to get HIV than anyone else. They were the first. So who comes to Miami? Who comes to Belglade but Haitian workers? And Belglade in 1986 probably had the highest AIDS rate in the United States. And when I was in high school, I remember local football teams refused to go there. They would literally on a Friday announce, we're not coming, and the game would be canceled. The marching band of teams wouldn't go there, as if standing on the field would give you AIDS. That's how afraid people were. And a lot of people in this audience are older, I can see. You remember that. That period of the early 80s when it was a death sentence. And people began to believe stupid things, that you could get it from the air, you could get it from a salad bar, you could get it from a toilet seat, or you could not. It is blood-borne, right? You can't get it from kissing or coughing. You can only get it from needles, through the womb, or through blood, sex, right? But kissing someone, being a student with a little kid would never give you HIV in any way. But that was the fear. And then they told their minister. They were kicked out of church and given $300 as a love offering and told, bye. Sorry. They were kicked out of their barber shop as if cutting someone's hair would give you HIV. So when this happened, Arcadia hit the national news, more than Richardson, more than it ever had. And these are just headlines I grabbed from papers all over North America. AIDS meets small minds in Florida town. Arcadia's AIDS children. A tiny Florida town turned ugly over AIDS. I could have put 1,000 headlines up there. I didn't just cherry pick 5, everybody. 1,000. This was one of the biggest stories of the day in 1986 and 1987. Then ABC News is going to cover it. And you remember when we had 3 news channels at night and you'd eat dinner? And that story on the news was what you talked about at the water cooler the next day. Same thing with jokes on Johnny Carson, right? How many people told the same joke the next day that they heard in his monologue? ABC News with Peter Jennings, and I'm going to show you the clip. They had, John Quinones, ABC News, Arcadia, Florida. You know those sign-offs, that old days of media that we even watch anymore? He never said this. A town without pity. Peter Jennings never said that. The host of ABC News, very famous man, never said a town without pity, never asked the question. And the man on the ground, you'll notice, will never say, is this a town without pity? And I was writing this book, and I knew what the title was when I started. Before I had a blank page, this was A Town Without Pity. That's rare for me to know what I'm going to call a book. But that's what this was known as. That's what we discussed. Is Arcadia a town without pity? Do they pity these children? And I called Vanderbilt, the news archive, where you find it's amazing, the archives they have. And I paid all this money, and I got the clip, and I panicked. It's not on here. And this is what yesterday, ABC News called Arcadia the town without pity. And I called them, and they sent me the clip right before the commercial. Remember the days they'd say, when we come back? And he said, 3 boys with AIDS in a small town in Florida. And behind him, it said, a town without pity, ? And it was a reference to a 1960, if anyone remembers the film and the song, it was a reference to a Kirk Douglas film about a town in Germany that a pretty blonde woman was raped by 3 GIs, and the town turned on her, not the GIs, right? And someone, I don't know who, I couldn't find anyone associated with the segment, called it A Town Without Pity. And then there was a famous song by Gene Pitney that you can hear on YouTube, very famous song, A Town Without Pity. So that became Arcadia's moniker, its nom de guerre, its name of infamy, right? For at least a decade. And they've fought it ever since, and I'm sure they want to kill me for writing a book called The Town Without Pity. Now, when I said I wanted to talk about Arcadia and how my stories can inform people studying Florida, if you can learn anything. Arcadia is in DeSoto County. I looked it up. It's 62.4 miles from here south. It's not far at all. It's the only city in DeSoto County which is almost entirely agricultural. When I say, and people tell me this, that one author called Arcadia an isolated island of a place. There's one road in and out, 17. One road east that goes off towards Palmdale into nothing. And 2 roads that goes into the back, Myakka of Sarasota County and that Myakka area of Bradenton, right? Gibsonton area. There's just farmland. It's farmland upon farmland upon farmland. And only one housing development that would be like a Port Charlotte or a Cape Coral, right? A small place called Lake Susie on I-75. Anyone know what I'm talking about right there? And as I told you, 50 miles and 50 years from Sarasota. Craig Pittman, the great Florida journalist who's been here several times, he wrote an article on Arcadia, and he said visiting Arcadia from Tampa or St. Pete was like swimming upstream in the river of time. That's what he wrote 35 years ago. And in 1960, this woman, Rosemary Farley, does anyone know her husband, what he wrote? He wrote all the Black Stallion books. He's a very famous writer for his day. And she lived in Venice Beach in the winter in New York, was a socialite and a writer. And she traveled through Arcadia in 1960 and was so gobsmacked by old Florida that she wrote an article. And this was a New York Times article in 1960. Imagine, they probably had 2,500 people there, right? And she wrote something to the effect that there are people here who for 5 generations have not stepped foot outside of the county. Right? And I found that fascinating, I mean, it's just fascinating to me. Now, how did it start? And why was it a little bit different? I was talking to Mike today about it. Arcadia was a phosphate boomtown. We think about phosphate, right? We think of Polk County, right? This is the center of the phosphate world. Arcadia was where it started. They actually found phosphate in the river, in the Peace River, where they first found phosphate. They were on barges looking to get across to Lake Okeechobee. Where can we build a canal to get across to Lake Okeechobee? So they went up the Caloosahatchee, and they went up Myakka River, and they went up the Peace River. And the captain on the boat looked down, and he saw some bones in the river. Francis LeBaron. Has anyone ever heard this story? People in the phosphate industry might have. He looks down, and he sees bones, like mastodon bones. And he goes, ooh, put those in a barrel. We're going to send them to the Smithsonian. Maybe they're valuable. And he gets a letter back, and they say, thanks for the bones. They're nice, but did you notice what the dirt was? And they're like, it's a white phosphate. And LeBaron quits his job and runs to Florida and tries to get a piece of the action because it's very valuable. So this is when Arcadia booms. Arcadia was a production center of phosphate well before this area, right? But then once they all come down, they find it everywhere, and Polk County takes over. But more than anything else, and this comes back again and again when I think about DeSoto County, it's a tough place. Historically, it's a place with cattle rustlers. Historically, it's a place with very little crime, but then every once in a while, outstanding acts of violence, right? It's wide open prairie that's on the edge of what is called the 90-mile prairie. Has anyone heard of that, the 90-mile prairie? Not many people when you study Florida. In the 1870s and the 1860s, when the Civil War ended, south of Lakeland, south of Ocala, was barren, devoid of anyone but Native Americans, really. Some escaped slaves, some Cuban fishermen, but there was no one down there. And you could go out into the prairie and gather Florida cows. The cows were set free and were the ancestors of Andalusian cows from the Spanish. You know, the Florida scrub cow. It was mangy, it was small. You know, it was a survivor. I called it a raw bone survivor, right? I admire the Florida scrub cow. Other cows, other breeds were brought here from the north, like Holsteins, and they would starve to death on Florida land. Until we brought in better grass, northern cows couldn't live here. And so we had this little mangy survivor. And these cowboys could create entire estates, family wealth that bleeds into the Likes family, for example, the Parker family, Ziba King. He was a AWOL Confederate who came to Florida with nothing, and by the end of his life in 1900 owned 1 in 7 cows. He was a millionaire. He owned banks. He owned businesses. He owned much of Florida. And so this 90-mile prairie, though, think about it. You come out on this prairie, and it's you and your gun in your hands. You know, who has read, you know, A Land Remembered, the famous Florida book? That's exactly what we're talking about, right? So who can survive this? Tough people, right? Tough, rugged individualists, the same type of people who conquered the American West, right? But with that legacy of rugged individualism comes a history of settling your disputes with a gun, fighting over land. Arcadia, DeSoto County saw a range war in 1895. This is a Frederick Remington. Has anyone ever known this? A Frederick Remington series called Cracker Cowboys of Florida. Remington did not like Florida cowboys. Remington was the artist of the West. I live in Fort Worth, and we have a Sid Richardson Museum, a wealthy oilman, and he spent his life collecting Frederick Remington paintings. They're beautiful, but it's like graphic art for magazines, and he loved the West. And to him, it was mythical, and everyone looked like Gene Autry, and the Indians all looked like Geronimo, right? He comes to Florida, and what do the cowboys look like? They have slouch hats because it's so hot. They have 3 dogs, that the same type of dogs that people go hog hunting. You know, you need the little dog to chase the cow out of the bush. You need the runner to run him down, and you need the bulldog to grab him. You know, and they had whips. And Remington thought that was just not sporting. That was not heroic, right? And he did not like Arcadia, and he rolls in the middle of a range war. They're fighting a range war in 1895. I mean, when did the West close, right? Do you know when Florida's last range war was? In the 30s, right? In the 30s. And that was a continuation of one that started in the 20s, right? Cattle barons having their men shoot other cattle barons' men in Florida. I mean, Johnny Weissmuller was playing Tarzan in Florida in the 30s. Babe Ruth was hitting home runs, and Joe DiMaggio and Marilyn Monroe was down here in the 30s. They're fighting range wars. Arcadia was even mentioned in the book that people love. This is Florida's founding myth, founding story. I love it. I love Patrick D. Smith's work. He's from Mississippi, an incredible writer who fell in love with Florida and wrote some great books. This is one, if you haven't read one about frontier Florida, it's beloved. I looked it up I was looking for a new copy or used copy. I went to Amazon, and it had 4,000 reviews of a book published, I don't know when, in the 70s, Mike, sometime. Anyway, he wrote about the McIver family settling the Florida prairie. And they go down there, and they're getting yellow fever, and they're attacked by Seminoles, and They have cows that are bitten to death by mosquitoes and swarms. I mean, it is just struggle, struggle, struggle. And then someone steals their herd. And so two of the workers, their characters in the book, are sitting by the fire, and they're like, we got to go get these bastards. We need some men. We know where the cows are. They're down in the big cypress. We're going to go get them. Let's get some men. We're the meanest men in Florida. And what does Patrick D. Smith choose? Arcadia, right? I love that. Arcadians would tell me this story. I knew this, but they'd go, we're in Patrick D. Smith's book. It's awesome, right? They love this reputation, right? And so what changes in Florida, and how does Arcadia fall behind? Think about it. Before World War II, before World War I, definitely, but before World War II, what land was valuable in Florida? The land that you could grow things on, the land that you could mine things on, and the land that you could rear cattle on, right? After World War II, what's important now? Location, 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 right? This is when we see the developments, the Florida dream, live the Florida dream to the middle class man. And so now people want to live on the coast. Right? Everyone has that story where I grew up. His grandfather owned half of Inglewood. He's got nothing now, right? We all have that story of, because it wasn't worth anything in 1925, the coastal city. Sanibel was not valuable in 1900, except for boating, right, and fishing. But what happens is Arcadia falls back into its traditional agricultural roles. These are important. These are great, proud industries, but it has nothing else. And so Arcadia is a citrus center. And it's the same citrus center in 2026 that it was in 1926, right? It has the cattle industry. 1 in 7 cows went through here. Then, because of its increasing poverty, my county was the same. Charlotte County, Punta Gorda, in 1945 was poor in agriculture. We had 3 big ranches. That's all we had, and fishing. By 1955, we start to have other developments. We have people moving in, property goes up, and pretty soon we leave, culturally, I'm not saying leave them behind. I don't want to say that. Culturally, we become different. The same country folks that grew up in one place and the other were the same. By 1960, they're 2 different worlds. That quickly. And so Arcadia becomes poorer and poorer and poorer relative to the coast, right? It becomes, after one of the hurricanes in 2020, when was Ian, right? I think it was Ian, maybe one before that, but certainly Charley in 2004. Arcadia became the poorest county in the state. And it's right next to the coast. And to me, living in South Florida, it was like, it's got to be up there in the Panhandle, right? It's got to be one of those places that's poor, not here. And so over the years, and this is my development mind working from the Swamp Peddlers, over the years, what industries did it attract? The prison, the state mental hospital, G. Pierce Wood. It had 1,000 employees in low-paying jobs to oversee 1,500 patients. It has 3 prisons today. 3. And so it's low-paying jobs or working in the fields, working in some agricultural capacity. Very proud people, very proud way of life that hasn't really changed. And I find that completely fascinating because this is Florida. What's the one thing we know about Florida? And that's change. Change. I mean, Florida adds 2 to 3 million people, new residents a decade since 1950. Right? We know change. Polk County is the fastest growing county now, or one of them. And to have that place so close was always so fascinating to me. So now keep Arcadia in mind. But it did, and again, I'm not trying to punch down. I was given a talk and someone asked, why, do you have to punch down at Arcadia? And I'm like, I'm not punching down. I'm talking about the history of a place and describing how it is. By the 70s, though, it saw the first African-American mayor in Southwest Florida. It saw the first black football coach at any integrated school in Florida, and a good deal of integration. Its schools integrated, but there were problems, right? It was still a black and white town. There was still some anger at desegregation by the Richardson case. The DeSoto County Marching Band, the high school, wore Confederate Army officers' uniforms and openly refused to march in parades behind black high school bands. One time they walked away from the Sarasota Christmas parade, and the newspaper was appalled at the racism, and the school board of Arcadia celebrated it. They were defending the town, right? So a lot of legacies of the Old South, and a lot of legacies of resistance and resistance to authority, resistance to the federal government, which will come into play. So quickly, James Richardson. I told you, his children were poisoned, and Richardson is accused of killing the children for insurance. He lived in an old rental, what they called a hotel. There were like 4 apartments. 2 of them were derelict. And next door to him was a babysitter, a friend who had been arguing with Richardson, a woman named Betsy Reese. And Richardson was arrested for this, though the sheriff, the assistant state's attorney, and the state's attorney all interviewed the insurance man, and he presented his records. I never wrote a policy. He didn't buy a policy. He didn't have any money. I was coming back next week. He doesn't have a policy. And Richardson had a business card, and on the back, the man had written, all right, if you do this, it's $2 a month. You do this, it's $3. That was it. Like you're going to the doctor, and they write the appointments. The sheriff immediately claimed that was a receipt and told the press that. The motive was insurance. The motive was insurance. It's a dastardly crime, and we have caught the dastardly, the person who committed it. Stuff like that, jumping out in front of the press. Why? That was a big question for especially the African-American community of Arcadia. Because the babysitter, Betsy Reese, had been in prison for murdering her husband. Her second husband had died after eating dinner. She was an odd woman. I read through the lines that she was a little mentally uneven, but I don't know that 100%. But she was definitely an odd woman who people noticed. She was a stranger, was dressed strangely, wore dungarees in court with a hat. Just a different woman, but she was feared by the African American community. And there were rumors that circulated. The first rumor was that the sheriff was running bolita parlors, bingo parlors in the quarters, and taking a cut, illegal gambling. Right? That was a big rumor. Also rumors that the sheriff had stills. They said stills out by the river. Stills in the 70s, 1967, stills? Are you still making moonshine? That was one rumor. But the biggest rumor of all that dogged the sheriff for decades was that he was sleeping with Betsy Reese's daughter, a white sheriff in a segregated town. And that rumor went around the other sheriff deputies, the local police, but especially the black community, where for the next 20 years, it was just a truism. Right? She even had a daughter, and everyone said the daughter looked like him. Now, he took a DNA test later and adamantly said that he did not have a child with that woman. Did he have an affair with her? I don't know, but you would hear things. Policemen would go, for whatever reason, the chief of our entire sheriff's department patrols the quarters at night. People would wonder that in the press, openly. And I spoke with African-American members of the community, and they all told me, yeah, we all thought that. Everyone thought that. There's no question about it. And it dogged the sheriff for 20 years. And so lots of people believe that. Now, I want you to remember this quick story. I don't get sappy in my talks, and I don't get sappy in my books usually. This was the funeral at Smith Brown School in October of 1967. 7 white caskets, 7 children in white linen, all in a row, oldest to youngest. The parents, James, he's not yet arrested. The wife is out of it. And they're standing there, and they visit each casket, and they sit down, and it's whites and blacks, and a large part of the white community donated money for this. That everything was paid for. He was dirt poor. They were broke. And a little girl gets up. Named Sharon Thomas. Remember that, because I'm going to bring it back to her. Little girl, about 8 years old, 9 years old, and she sings in a falsetto voice in a white lacy dress. She sings, "How Great Thou Art." and the place starts to break down, and Richardson starts to wail. And then everyone starts to wail, and there's about 1,000 people here, and it's getting to be mass hysteria. And they actually had to step in and stop the ceremony until they could whisk the Richardsons away to the funeral at the segregated part of the cemetery. And they're all buried, and Richardson is tried in 1968. Unfortunately, the case was not just a case of locals grabbing. What I think happened was someone killed these children. They didn't have the ability to figure it out. They didn't have the staff. They didn't have the know-how, and the sheriff approached this the wrong way from the very beginning. They grabbed the first man they could, but this was 1967. Does anyone know what happened in the summer of 67 in Florida? All over America. It was the summer of rage. Famous African-American riots in cities. And in Tampa, a policeman, a black boy was running, a teenager was running from a policeman, not fighting him, and the policeman shot him in the back and killed him. And Tampa rioted. Central Avenue blew apart. So people were fearful. They were fearful here. They were fearful in Punta Gorda. They were fearful all over the state, white and black. What is going to come? In Arcadia, white shop owners sat in chairs in front of their downtown businesses with shotguns all night. Small black community, about 25% of the population, but that was the fear. And the sheriff organized a policeman's auxiliary, white men who were given arms training. The black auxiliary, which leaders of the black community said, we'd like to help. We'll patrol the quarters so there's no young kids setting fire to things out of anger. They didn't get arms training. They didn't get arms, right? That was the fear. And Frank Schaub would say to the press, we don't have those problems we have in big cities, but what we have is control. Control. He was, he sounded like an old South sheriff, right? He also would say, vile things. He had a theory that black brains were smaller than white brains, and he would tell the press, right? And this just didn't look good. Didn't look good. Well, unfortunately, the case was handed to a district attorney, Frank Schaub from Bradenton, a northerner who moved to Florida, went to Stetson, and he was not from Old Arcadia, didn't really like Old Arcadia, didn't like the sheriff. But what he did do was win in court. And if you got in front of him and he got a true bill from a grand jury, you were going down, friend. This was a man with a 95% conviction rate. He was the first attorney to beat F. Lee Bailey in court. That was a shocking thing. F. Lee Bailey, the famous defense attorney, represented the fugitive and the Boston Strangler. He beat him in a case in Naples, right? But Schaub didn't take a case unless he could take you down. Right? He cherry-picked cases, and if the maximum was 20 years, he asked the judge to give you 20 years. If it was death, he went for it. So if you got in front of him and he took the case, you were going down. Didn't matter if it was 1 year, first crime, didn't matter. And Schaub took the case. Grim workhorse of a lawyer, and in those days they wanted tough justice, in the courts. Be tough on crime. So he was. He took the case, but he buried all the interviews with the insurance man. That did not make it into court. He buried an interview with a minister when the minister claimed that Richardson said he did not have insurance. And they never found any source of the parathion. No bag, nothing. But the next day, who calls the police and says she found a bag of parathion in a shed behind the Richardson residence that the police had searched 5 times? Betsy Reese. She claims to have found a bag of parathion. So it shouldn't be used into court because you can't tie the two. But in court, they essentially refer to it as the murder weapon. Right? The judge shouldn't have allowed that. And the sheriff says in court in Fort Myers, because it was a district, in Fort Myers, he says to everyone there, to the jury, that I got the receipt. I found the receipt for the insurance, and it was a business card. He claimed later that was a mistake, but in my opinion, it was perjury, right? It shouldn't have happened. There wasn't a motive, and there wasn't a murder weapon. But Richardson got life. He got the death penalty, which was later commuted to life, right? Now, that's him in Rayford. The press knew something was wrong. There were stories about something hinky happened in Arcadia, something weird. Schaub took the case, I believe, and I don't know why, he died quite a while ago. I believe Schaub took the case because the sheriff ran out so far ahead, so loudly, that there was too much pressure to let this go, to not catch someone. Schaub was able to get a true bill from a jury in Tampa, but as they say, you can indict a ham sandwich in front of a grand jury. And that's why Schaub ran with it. I think he just had to do it. I don't know. That's my argument. Mark Lane, he was a Jewish attorney, a Kardashian-like attorney that would jump in front of issues from New York. He wrote the Kennedy conspiracy theory book, Rush to Judgment. He's the first one to come up with that theory. He represented Jane Fonda and her cases. He represented James Earl Ray. He represented Jim Jones and survived Jonestown. Right? This was a guy who he represented the American Indian movement at Wounded Knee. He loved to be in front of the press. And he read about this on Newsweek. And he got invited to speak at USF, and he rented a car and drove over to Arcadia. And he wrote a book, terrible book. And it didn't do well. And the reviewers, one reviewer hit it on the nail on the head. It's a terrible book. Half of it was cherry-picked trial transcripts. He had mistakes all over. He misspelled DeSoto. He misspelled, it was a disaster. And someone wrote, there's probably something wrong with the Richardson case, but too bad Ralph Nader didn't write this book. Because we don't like this guy. He's a talking head and we don't trust him, right? And so Richardson was forgotten. The state Supreme Court heard an appeal that I read, and I can't even understand what the lawyer was trying to do at all, and I'm not a lawyer, but still. And Richardson is forgotten, okay? Let's think about it. 1971-72, Richardson is not in the mind of Arcadians or Floridians, though this case was in Newsweek, was on national news. I want you to remember this guy. He's one of the heroes of this book, the hero of this book. Remus Griffin. Every small town in Florida has one. We had one named Wampus. They're those crazy ne'er-do-wells. They go in and out of, the ones the law knows. That they may arrest them for a DUI or may send them home. Remus was one of those guys who would go into a bar and say, I'll fight all y'all. And they'd beat him up. And then he'd go back into the bar and have drinks, right? I called him a good old-fashioned Arcadia, DeSoto County ne'er-do-well, and he was. When he was 7 or 8, he stole a Coca-Cola delivery truck. When he was 17, he and his brother broke into the courthouse because they heard in the property room there was a brick of cocaine. This isn't a high-end, high-order thinker at his young age. Well, at 17, he was put into DeSoto Correctional's adult prison for a 2-year bit at 17. And probably didn't like authority anyways, but certainly hated the popo after that, right? He gets out at 19, and he's dating. This is like out of a Grisham book, right? He's dating a 23-year-old woman. He's like 20, 21. He's dating a woman, 1979, and she's the secretary of the former district attorney, the assistant to the state's attorney, Frank Schaub, an old Arcadia, long-running old family, Treadwell, Red Treadwell III, who in the press, it was reported in the 80s, would drink a lot. Now, I don't know if this is true. I'm just telling you what Tampa Tribune and they all reported. And the story was he would drink in the mornings or at lunch and come back in the office blotto. I don't know if this is true, but that was what was reported. And he would say, I put an innocent man in prison. I guess crying into his drink, I don't know. And he told the secretary that. And he said, and the evidence is right in those file cabinets. And she comes home and tells her boyfriend. And Remus goes, what? And he said, and I'm making this up, but this is essentially what he said. Can I borrow your keys, honey? I'm going to go get some cigarettes. And at midnight, on one night in 1979, he, with a key, broke into the office of a former ADA, assistant state's attorney, and stole the Richardson files. He looks through the box and he finds interviews, and he doesn't quite understand what he sees. He sees like 900 pages, 1,000 pages. It's in my book. And he realizes this is going to send me back to prison. I'm going back to prison. I'm a felon if they know I have this box. So he goes to the mayor, the African-American mayor of Arcadia that had been elected shockingly. He says, what do I do with this box? This is what Remus said. The mayor never admitted any of this. The mayor told him, according to Remus, you better get rid of that or we're both going to end up in the Peace River, right? I don't know if this is true, but this is how Remus got the box. He stole it because he thought, like most Arcadians, even white Arcadians, something was wrong. He gives it to a woman who doesn't like the sheriff either, claims he sexually harassed her, told me she's an 80-something-year-old woman, and she goes, he's crooked as a dog's hind leg. That's what she told me. And he's never been arrested, and I have his FDLE file. Lots of smoke, no fire. She takes it to the Seminole Indian Reservation, where she's now living in Clewiston, working for the sheriff's department over there, and she hides it in her trailer knowing that a county cop or a state cop couldn't come onto her land. Hiding it, and it sits in a trailer for 7 years while this man is in prison. And it could have been washed away, burned in a fire, whatever. And Remus forgets about it. It's over. What do I do? It's just in a trailer in a small house outside of Clewiston. So we'll come back to Remus. He returns and deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. 1986. The three little boys are diagnosed. Arcadia loses its mind. The Rays are told, don't come to school. They begin to fight. And the one thing I love about this story is Arcadians are tough frontier people, old Florida crackers, and that sense of, that term in my book, now it's like a pejorative, but it's not for old Floridians. They're very proud of that term. There's a Cracker House Museum right near here. The state runs one. And it's a very old term that I don't think, people think it relates to the cracking of whips of pioneers, but it's a word that predates that by hundreds of years. Scottish, they would say it's related to cracking a joke, to be a cracker, to be a troublemaker, but ornery, to be an ornery type. Ben Franklin used it to describe people in Appalachia, like those jerks, those crackers are bothering me, right? That was the sense of the word. Well, she's from Arcadia too, and she's as tough as them, and a mother bear she was, and she defended those children like a dog. The more they called them names, the more they went after that family, the more she fought back. And she found an attorney in Bradenton, a woman, tough as nails, self-made environmental attorney, not a criminal attorney, not anyone dealing with these type of issues, but she had taken on phosphate companies. She had taken on Tropicana for dumping orange waste into the Hillsborough River, right? Something like that. And she's reading the newspaper at home in her house with her husband, who's an attorney, and she goes, man, this is wrong. Someone should help these boys. And he goes, well, why don't you shut up and do it? And she went, okay, I will. And she contacts the Rays and spends a lot of money to help them, knowing that there should be a payoff in the end, but they almost went bankrupt. I met her junior partner, his first year of law school. I spoke at University of Florida a couple days back, and he walked up to me, and he was an emeritus Florida law professor, and he goes, I worked on that case. I was there with Judith when she did this, and he said she was a tough woman. And she went into Arcadia, and they sued. They went to federal court. And so as the case was building up in federal court, this is when ABC News arrives. This is in June 1987. And so I want to play this. And this is when America really first heard of the Rays, and the story went global. It was heard in Japan.
For, among others, handicapped children and police officers, but wouldn't give gays
about 10 seconds.
the same permission. President Reagan has named Dr. Eugene Mabry of the Mayo Clinic to head the new National Commission on AIDS, and the White House said it wouldn't necessarily name a gay man to serve on the commission itself. As the victims of AIDS will tell you, the great tragedy of getting the disease is often incredibly difficult to deal with, and so is the reality of being treated as if you had it when you didn't. ABC's John Quinones has a report tonight from Arcadia, Florida, on 3 children who have become the victims of such discrimination.
These are the Ray family children. With their boundless energy, they're the picture of good health. 8-year-old Randy, 9-year-old Robert, 10-year-old Ricky. It is hard to think of these boys as victims of AIDS, but they are. Because of the fear and ignorance about AIDS, the boys have become outcasts, shunned in their own hometown.
If they see us go by their church and there's out here, it's just like they just turn their head like we never exist. Everybody's been staring at us, and we ain't been able to go to school, and everybody's been being mean to us.
You get your arm down here.
The boys all suffer from hemophilia, a blood disorder which requires frequent injections of blood plasma. Each of them contracted the AIDS virus separately from contaminated blood. The kids have not yet developed AIDS. Researchers say that unlike most high-risk groups, only 3% of all hemophiliacs ever develop the full-blown disease.
We're like normal boys. You can't catch it. It's just like we're normal.
But many of the residents of this small farming community of Arcadia have not treated the boys normally. The county school district has not allowed the boys to attend classes with other students, even though medical experts say the AIDS virus cannot be transmitted through casual contact. When the family confided in their minister, he spread the word about the boys' infection and then told the Rays to stay away from church services.
I am deathly afraid of AIDS disease. Anybody that says they're not afraid of AIDS is a fool or a liar.
Even at a hometown fishing tournament, people try to avoid the Ray family.
I'm going to stay out here and fish, as long as I can, but if they come this way, I'm going to take my family and move.
What if the kids are brought to your kids' school?
Well, I just had to take my kid out and put him in private school.
You would do that?
You darn right I would.
The Ray boys can't even get a haircut at a local barber shop.
But they said that they weren't going to even touch our hair. They wouldn't cut it.
And they're going to have to look back one day, and I don't think it's too far in the future. They're going to look back and say, we treated them youngins wrong. And there ain't going to be nothing they can do but just hang their head in shame.
The family has now filed a federal lawsuit demanding that the kids be given an education with the rest of their classmates.
What do you want to do more than anything?
Go back to school so I can meet new friends and learn so I can have a good job when I grow up. Sometimes it makes me angry. What they're doing isn't right.
John Quinones, ABC News, Arcadia, Florida.
A couple things I just want to say briefly. When I say didn't have AIDS, in those days, it's still, they were trying to even America was wrapping its brain around AIDS. There's various stages of the virus. AIDS is the final stage. When he said they didn't have AIDS, they had HIV, right? That's the first thing. And then he said estimates of 3% of people with hemophilia, it was far, far higher. But that's what he meant. Now, once the news spread, but especially when Louise Ray found Judy Kavanaugh, the attorney, and went to federal court in Tampa, that's when Arcadia lost its collective mind, when the Rays won. They won in court because they were not a threat. The judge ruled that, and they had to go back to regular school. And that's when parents in the town formed a 1,000-member parental rights group, Citizens Against AIDS in Schools, and began to advocate for keeping children with AIDS around Florida, trying to change the law, trying to keep children with HIV out of school. It got heated to the point where, as the Rays now, the story goes nationwide, a truck would show up and bring 3 bicycles. People are mailing things. Hollywood comes knocking, right? These stories resonate with America. Do you remember Ryan White? Remember Ryan White? He was this beautiful teenage boy, about 13, 12. That age before boys are starting to be young men. They're still boys. He was just a beautiful kid. And he lived with a single mom, and pretty soon they started to say, she just wants the money. She's agitating for the money. She just wants the trips. She just wants this. And then you get the death threats. Then someone shot a bullet through Ryan White's window, right? It spins out of control. The same thing happened in Arcadia. The Rays don't care for their children. This is the gossip. Today, a woman told me yesterday she was just down there and heard that exact remembrance, right? They only wanted the money. They went to Knott's Berry Farm on a trip that was paid for by charity, and people got mad. They're going on a trip. That was Make-A-Wish Foundation, right? I mean, but that's how this was seen. And then you throw in the era in which AIDS was seen as a gay disease. So somehow 3 boys get thrown into this pot with homosexual men, and it becomes a gay issue. There's people at these rallies for Citizens Against AIDS in schools yelling, if the gays hadn't started this, we wouldn't be here now, right? And then the national press is like, ooh, say more. Keep speaking, crazy person, angry person. And so the press began to kind of agitate, and the people, so the temperature rose. You would see statements in the press, a waitress. I mean, who cares what a young woman waitress at Wheeler's restaurant says? But she goes, I think they need to, exterminate all the HIV patients, stuff like that. And of course, the press runs with it to make the town look even worse. And so there were no voices of moderation, right? It became an in or an out thing, and the Rays were out, and people who supported them stayed quiet. There were plenty of locals who thought it was appalling, but as Judy Kavanaugh told me, there were very few crockpots coming to the house, right? If things came to the family when they were destitute, it was from outsiders. It wasn't happening from within because of the fear. And you see a tie-in to race, weirdly. African Americans in the quarters did not care about this. Life was hard enough to worry about this. This was a white thing. And so at the first rally at the rodeo arena, they have a rally. The head of the group stands up and says, this judge, I'm paraphrasing, they are shoving this down our throats like they did with civil rights. So now race is involved. How on earth? And so this really spins out of control. And Louise Ray is not afraid. She goes on Larry King. She goes on Nightline. She goes on Montel and Oprah and Donahue and begins traveling. And that made everyone madder. That the kids are going to New York with her. Well, I spoke with a writer, and he goes, well, what would you do if my 2 little kids had this disease? I would take them to the moon. I don't care what people thought. I would give them whatever they needed. And the Rays really believed their lives were ending. I met the sister, the little girl you saw in there. I met her yesterday for the first time, an adult woman, a nursing professor. And she told me that when they found out that the family had discussed the boys would go to Tampa with the father and rent a boat and jump off the Skyway Bridge or under the Skyway Bridge and kill themselves, and the mother and the sister would live on. That was the level of fear and the level of angst and sadness in the family. And so this was a ray of whatever, a cause, something to fight about. It's not fair what they're doing. And the Rays fought and fought until the ruling happened. The first week of school, more than half the DeSoto kids stayed out. They even stayed out of the high school. They boycotted the high school. There were 3 bomb threats. A friend of mine worked for the local radio station, and he said the calls that we got were, kill them, horrifying things. They had plainclothes policemen in the halls. Not very plainclothes. They look like sheriff's deputies to me. But there were, I guarantee, and I do not know this, but there were FBI agents around. Had to be, because there were so many bomb threats. But Tuesday, a few more kids come back. And the kids at school don't really care. They don't. There was a picture of the Rays around the playground, and they're going, how's the trip to Atlanta? They want to know. What's it like being a star? The kids didn't care. The parents did. By Friday, Clifford Ray, the father, said to the family, I think we got this thing beat. He carried a gun all week. His attorney, Judy Kavanaugh's husband, was a former Marine. He carried a gun, a big, strong dude, followed the family everywhere. So in the press, you see scenes like this. Locals attacking and yelling at the cameras. And this man ran up to a cameraman and said, get that thing out of my face. Well, and so even for the average Joe, I can understand the fear. I was alive then. I shudder to think my father's elementary school was right outside of DeSoto County. He was a principal. What my family life would have been like when my father brought that back. He was a very caring man. He would have carried that till he died. You know, being thrust into this and having to be telling children, and my boss tells me you can't come here. Oh my God, he might have quit. But Arcadia did not have the language, did not have the words to, and I don't want to sit in judgment. I don't. And the average Joe working at Babcock Ranch as a mechanic or a cattleman, wife is a homemaker or works as a nurse, you know, an average working Joe. I can understand the fear. I can even understand saying, I don't want my child there, not believing the CDC. We remember COVID, right? Not believing advice, not believing the federal government. I can understand that. What I don't understand is the school board, the superintendent, the mayor. They did not get out in front of the mob and calm things down. On the contrary, they went the other way. They were leading Frankenstein's mob, especially when anyone here would have gone, well, what did Hillsborough do? What did Miami-Dade schools do? Well, Miami-Dade had 3 Haitian girls who got it in the womb in 1985. They kicked them out of school, forced them into a separate school. The teacher would pick them up in a car, and they would carry their lunches with them. A year later, they settled, gave them a lot of money, undisclosed, and apologized. And the man responsible in the school system for kicking them out apologized and said, we took the coward's way out. Right? Other counties dealt with this. Other counties in America, and this isn't just a poor white small farming community thing. Bergen, New Jersey, Manhattan threw kids out of school, Hillsborough threw kids, Bradenton, all over America, Ryan White, but they all came to terms with it pretty quickly, legally. Not Arcadia, not the powers that be, and it exacerbated this matter. Now, the last thing I want to say is that Ryan White made this situation even worse. America had dealt with Ryan White. He became a hero. He was on People magazine 3 times by this point, right? America knew now. We watched our after-school specials. You know, you all remember those days when a bar, you'd hear the bartender had HIV and it'd be empty as a cemetery. And then pretty soon that restaurant would close. That was the fear in those days, firing people across America for having HIV. That ended in court. That was really ending well before Magic Johnson. Well, Ryan White moves from Rushville, Indiana, where he's treated terribly, to a new suburb of Indianapolis. And guess what it's called? Arcadia. He moves to Arcadia, Indiana, and the scene in the national news is the student body comes out, they shake his hand, and they hug him, and they welcome him. Because by this point, any superintendent on earth would go, we are not doing that. I am not going to be at the front of a national witch hunt. We are going to treat this kid well, and we're going to take care of this. Schools all over the country were figuring this out. But Arcadia fought back. And so in the press, they would even say, powers that be, it's better for all of us if the Rays leave. It's your citizen, right? It's the saddest among you. You can't do that, you know. It was immoral, and that's what really bothered me. It wasn't the average Joe and the fear. You know, the mob's going to be the mob. It's the people who should have known better. Well, what happens? Does anybody know? Friday night, the Rays are visiting relatives. There's a uncle. I couldn't find him for an interview. He said in the paper he had a beer and a Valium, and he's sitting on a chair, and he wakes up, he claims, and the house burns down. He's saved by a friend and runs out. So what do Arcadians believe? Who set the fire? Who do Arcadians believe set the fire? The Rays. They believe the family set it or their attorney set it. And what does the national press believe? That this was Mississippi burning. They use the word firebombing in the press. Terrible journalism, right? But it was so ubiquitous, the story that the Rays, I had visions of men in 4x4s throwing Molotov cocktails. Get out of this town. That didn't happen. I was 25 miles away. I read the paper every day. I read 2 papers, in my family, Fort Myers News Press and the Tribune, and I didn't know this. I went to basketball games there thinking, not liking Arcadia, going, you're the people burned out of AIDS kids. What's wrong with you? I didn't like going there. And I live 25 miles away. In the national press, this became the most hated town in America. It swept the nation, and donations rolled in. It was an arson that was set somewhere back in the house, but that they never really figured it out. It didn't start from wires. Who knows? Who knows? But the Ray's attorney told me that they were terrified, that they fled for their lives. They went to a hotel outside of Sarasota and were recognized and kicked out. The innkeeper wouldn't let them stay there because they had HIV. So they relocate to Sarasota at Gochio Elementary near Booker, and they're also received well with open arms in the press. And Sarasota County Schools quickly writes one of the most advanced policies for HIV students with AIDS. So much so that towns around the country followed that policy. The state was terrified, and the State Board of Education didn't want to make a policy. They just didn't want to wade into this. So now, let's bring back Richardson really quick. Right when this ends, this is August 1987. 1 year passes. Arcadia is barely breathing after this. Barely. It's hated. People are locally, they're going, we're not a town without pity. We didn't do this. We didn't burn them out. Stop, A frail African-American woman at a nursing home in Wauchula has Parkinson's disease, I believe, certainly dementia, and probably Alzheimer's. And she's in her chair every day and not speaking, and then starts to say, I killed them children 100 times. And it's Bessie Reese. And her caregiver is from the quarters, an African-American woman. And that news rifles through Arcadia and to Mark Lane. Right. This is a guy who sat remember the movie JFK, where the Oliver Stone film, where they indicted a guy for killing the president with literally no evidence. Mark Lane was right there, right? This is a guy that met with Yasser Arafat. He wanted to be in the press. That news gets back to Mark Lane, and he beelines it for Arcadia. I'm back. This is almost 20 years later. 1988, August of 1988, and he holds a rally at Smith Brown School, which is the old high school where the funeral was, that's now a community center. He holds a rally, and it's mostly African Americans, a few journalists, but even the wider press doesn't care, doesn't know. And he plays a message from Richardson, and he says to everyone, is there any new evidence? Speak power, he believes that people are hiding the truth, and no one was. No one was. Except everyone leaves, and at the very end, a man comes up in a cowboy hat, and he goes, I got a box. And he says, I've been in prison. Would I go back if I gave you this box? And he looks it up, and he says, no, the statute of limitations is worn out. And he goes, well, I got a box. And so Richardson gets the box. And this is when, 1 year after the raise, Arcadia blows up again, because now we know what happened. Remus. Peter Gallagher and Charles Flowers, they were incredible investigative reporters, hotheads and industry crazies, actually. They wrote an article for the Miami Herald that should have been a Pulitzer. It's one of the best investigative pieces I've ever read, and it blows this case apart. Mark Lane gets James Richardson on the first ever episode of Inside Edition. He also gets Wolper Productions. You know what film they did in Hollywood series? Roots. To get in on the rights. It never happened, but they were there, and they paid for a lot of Richardson's first appearances when he was freed. And the case on Inside Edition, David Frost, the first host, says, I think he's innocent. Don't you? If you agree, write your governor. And they put Governor Martinez's address on the screen, and he gets thousands of letters. Could you imagine a First show on a cable TV? Who would do that? 4,000 people, thousands. And finally, you get the Black Congressional Caucus involved. You get other people involved. And Mark Lane, who screams at the highest heavens, and these writers. And the story becomes too big for him to resist. In early 1989, late 1988, early 1989, the governor appoints Miami state's attorney, Janet Reno, the famous Janet Reno, later became Attorney General of the United States. Incredibly respected right and left, and seen as uber objective. And she begins reviewing the files. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement goes all over the state re-interviewing people. They find that 2 men who testified against Richardson recanted. They were jailhouse snitches. Then they read the files and they see, just in basic jurisprudence, you didn't turn over exculpatory evidence. You can't do that. Then they start to receive other people writing letters, including an old Arcadia police chief who said, Frank Schaub lied. I know he lied. I don't have any evidence, but he lied. I mean, this kind of stuff is coming out. And so Richardson is released in a very dramatic hearing in the Arcadia courthouse in March of 1989. Now, just quickly, I want to tell you, Richardson was not declared innocent. He was not exonerated. Essentially, the trial was thrown out. It was just nol prost. So he was released, but he could not ask for reparations or any type of payment for his years in prison, as there's a fund for that. He couldn't do it. And he was destitute. He and his wife divorced. He was living in Daytona Beach, and he went to a doctor that gave him health care for free, and the doctor was some sort of cardiologist who ended up in Wichita. The doctor had an adult daughter with Down syndrome, and this man believed Richardson was so innocent that Richardson became the caretaker of the adult girl with Down syndrome and lived in Wichita on a farm and took care of a girl with special needs. Even his warden said at Tomoka in Daytona Beach, said, everybody in here is innocent, wink, wink, but James is innocent. He's the only one I know who's innocent, right? Finally, on a unanimous vote, House and Senate in Florida, Matt Gaetz pushed this through, right and left. They voted to pay him, and he ended up receiving about $50,000 for every year he was in prison. $50,000. It took him longer to be paid than he was in prison. And he died in 2023. Now, this is one of the things I want to tell you. Now, remember that little girl who sang How Great Thou Art? I don't get caught up when I give talks, and I don't get caught up writing books, and this made me cry. He comes back to Arcadia in 2013 with an attorney trying to kind of get in the press to drum up support for reparations, for something. The state passed a law to pay him. He comes back to Arcadia, and 7 little girls sing How Great Thou Art. And the mayor, who had just finished her term, the former mayor of Arcadia, gives him the key to the city, and it's Mayor Sharon Thomas Goodman in Arcadia. And it's just amazing to me, that scene. And Richardson, it's a very dramatic moment at the cemetery when he says, you're free, you're finally free, I'm free. And it should be in a movie. It's powerful stuff. This poor man. Now, the Rays, meeting their sister yesterday was gut-wrenching, phenomenal. Ricky Ray lived into the early 90s, and as he became a teen and got sicker and sicker, you would see the videos, and he had an acceptance of death and dying that I wish I'll have in 20 or 30 years. I wish we will all have. He was Gandhi-like. It was strange. You could see it in the way he talks. Very smart about politics. I mean, uneducated DeSoto County parents. Louise Ray was a smart woman, and Ricky Ray was a smart boy. And just would tell people, you know, I'm going to be free. I'm going to die of AIDS, but I'm not going to have AIDS when I die. I'm going to be free of AIDS. And just a powerful, and he affected lots of people. He was a fan of the Buccaneers. I love the Bucs, but He loved the Bucks, and they were horrible then. And he asked to be buried with his favorite Buccaneers blanket on his casket, which the Bucks did not deserve in 1992, I promise you. It's just amazing, amazing. They moved away, and Louise Ray went to nursing school and became a very successful nurse, not just a practical nurse, but beyond that. And she worked with Porter Goss for a reparations act to pay people with hemophilia, families of hemophilia sufferers who contracted HIV because our blood supply was not protected, and pushed it through. And Bill Clinton wanted to make this one of his signature things, along with Porter Goss, who was a Republican. But Bill Clinton became friends with Ricky Ray. They spoke somewhat often, not just a few times for politics, but they spoke as Bill Clinton was running for office. Ricky Ray knew enough that this guy will win and maybe pass this act that I'm not going to benefit from, but my parents will. His brother died and had some very bad problems. HIV can affect your brain and your well-being, and became violent and had a tough ending. The final brother, because of medicines and the date he finally got to the final stage of AIDS, lived into adulthood. Married a woman who had children, and then they adopted and was actually a father well into his 40s. But he's going to die 3 months before James Richardson. And so lastly, how to put this all into context, right? How to wrap this up. And I want to say, for those of you who think I'm hard on Arcadia or from there, both of these cases happened elsewhere in Florida, right? Didn't Gil King speak Bone Valley about a wrongfully convicted man in the first lecture here? I don't have to go far to find a wrongfully convicted man, black or white, in Florida. There have been dozens and dozens, and some we don't even know of, right? That's a problem nationwide, right? A sheriff swinging his power stupidly in the 60s? Wonder where that happened. America-wide. And the same thing with HIV. Ryan White was not the only one. A boy in Bradenton, middle-class family, had HIV. Chris Case, heartbreaking. He got HIV, and a housekeeper found out and immediately called the school board, as if he was carrying the bubonic plague, and he was kicked out of school, right? This happened nationwide. Rich, poor, farming community, rural community. It happened in Florida. It happened as the Ray's house burned down. I looked it up. There were 5 blowout cases just that I could find in a quick review in Arizona, in Indiana, in Illinois, in Iowa, in Florida, in New York, right? So these cases could have happened anywhere. But as I say in the beginning of my book, and that was a question, are these related? No, they're not. But what is related is how Arcadia reacted to them, and what does it tell us about the town, right? Was it a town without pity? I don't know. But this is the blow up. This is what it was known as, right? And I think it was kind of put best, this open-ended, what do we learn from this? I can only say we can learn about the history of Arcadia through these events. But is there a deeper, wider message about fear? It happens. It happened during COVID, right? Or racism, right? This happened. And the mayor of Arcadia, the first African-American mayor, he was retired, and this is in the 90s, and they interviewed him, and he said, look, this isn't a bad place. Sharon Thomas Goodman, in talking to Richardson, said, we're not a town without pity. An African-American former mayor says this. He said, we're not a town without pity. Not everybody here ran out the Rays, and not everybody here poisoned James. I'm tired of talking about it. He said, but I'll tell you this, it happened. and that's the way I left it. That's the way I left the book. Open-ended, right? What do we take away from our treatment of the least among us, right? The saddest among us, the neediest. And that really was my takeaway in this book. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Jason, thank you so much for that riveting presentation. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm sure everybody else in this room did too. and there were not a whole lot of folks that left, that's for sure. We always right on the edge of our seats. Anyway, we have a little bit of time, well, even though we've run over a little bit.
Sure. I'm sorry if everybody's for going long.
We can, I guess, address one or two questions, and then I'm going to escort Jason out to the books, and he can certainly follow up out there too. So,
any questions?
I'm going to defer to my students here. I'm sure they have a question, and they didn't raise their hand, but I'm sure they have a question.
I didn't get any questions last time I was here for the Swamp Peddler, so don't feel bad. Thank you.
They're chickening out. Okay. Why don't we follow up? Why don't we follow up out in Honeyman Pavilion? And I'm sure that Jason will.
Right. I
answer
appreciate
a
it. Thank
question
you,
or two.
everyone, for staying here and not fleeing. So thank you.
Okay.
I might have. Is that okay?